term is maybe a new one to a variety of our listeners. So could you just give us your interpretation and definition of triangulation and how it relates to Barack Obama?
Right. So the term originates during the Clinton administration, has a description of the way in which President Clinton manipulated liberals, kind of pacified them, making promises to them and not fulfilling those promises, but capitulated to the right in the form of NAFTA, in the form of a very harsh welfare bill, in the form of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and a number of policies that were right of center. So it was Clinton's way of playing off the right in political left, but really shortchanging his base, shortchanging the left in the process. So I simply transposed that concept onto the black-white divide in America during President Obama's campaign for the presidency and during his first term. And I illustrate throughout the book how Barack Obama has given the impression of accommodating the interest of black voters, but has in fact been far more accommodating to the right of center sensibilities of white voters, and in fact has kept a healthy political distance from black voters. And we're not just talking about ignoring issues of race. We're talking about affirmative disavowals of race. How many times has the president said, I'm not president of black America, I'm president of all America, or I'm president of the United States of America? And you can imagine George Bush or Ronald Reagan or any number of Republicans saying the same thing. African Americans would be terribly offended. But we have a president who's been engaged in the affirmative disavowal of race, not just not mentioning race.
So I want to ask both of you this. So do you think that this is a political aversion or a political calculation on the part of President Obama? I mean, I see both sides of it, but then I wonder, what is the president supposed to do? I mean, is this really worth the price of the ticket, as Professor Harris points out in his book? Because if you have President Obama stating that these policies are specific and geared toward the African American community or the Latino community, and some would argue that he already does that with the Latino community or with the gay community. But if he came out with specific policy statements for those particular segments of the population, do you think that he would even be president today or even stand in a strong position, although it's been weakened somewhat over the last couple of weeks, but in a position to be reelected as our first black president?
Well, I take a different look at this in a sense that I really do take seriously that the fact that African Americans are the most loyal constituency of the Democratic Party, and they should be rewarded for their loyalties like other constituencies. And so when I hear the president say and his supporters say that I have to be president of all Americans, I wonder why the president doesn't say that to Jewish Americans when they lobby him on behalf of Israel, or the gay and lesbian activists when they lobby him on important issues related to marriage equality and gay and lesbian rights, or the Latino community when they raise issues about immigration reform. So the question becomes, I think, for black voters, a tension between the symbolic and the substantive. And what is really driving the support of the president? Are black voters our primary, as the most loyal constituency of the Democratic Party? Are we merely here to protect the president from criticism from the right, or are we, like other constituencies, what's important to us is that we put our issues on the agenda? So there's this tension between protection and pressure. And I think pressure is far more important than putting issues like criminal justice reform, issues that the president, as candidate himself, promised that he would do, rather than that there should be this sort of grin and bear it attitude, because if you raise questions of race, then this will do damage to the president.
Professor Smith, what's your take on it? Do you think it's a political aversion or a calculation?
It's primarily a calculation that I don't doubt that having read both the president's books, that there's some aversion to tackling race head on. I recall speaking with Representative Frederica Wilson of Florida, a member of the Congressional Black Caucus, when I was doing the research for my book. And one of the things she said, both during the interview and publicly, was that if you have the president, the first black president of the United States, address issues of race explicitly in the context of his reelection campaign, he will lose. So why not wait until, and she used this term, she said, why not wait until he becomes a lame duck president, and then he'll have free reign to do what he wants to. But in some ways, President Obama's failure to address issues of race have made it less likely that he will win re-election. And let me give you an example. People complain, and Romney during last night's debate hammered the president on the high unemployment rate. But of course, the unemployment rate for white Americans is high, but it's not as bad as the overall unemployment rate. It's just a little more than 7%. The black unemployment rate is double that. The Latino rate unemployment rate is more than 10%, somewhere between 10 and 11%. So imagine if Obama had focused on that epidemic unemployment rate among blacks, if he had focused on that, and if he had focused on the unusually high unemployment rate among Latinos, imagine what impact that would have had on the overall unemployment rate. That is, Romney would have had less of a target if he if President Obama had taken specific initiatives in the Latino and black community. It would have brought down the overall unemployment rate. So this is one example of where an aversion to race or a political calculation that you won't address race actually hurts your overall campaign. It actually undercuts you politically in general.
Mm-hmm. So in my view, from what I'm hearing from both of you, and correct me if I'm wrong, do you think that this has been a hollow victory?
You know what? I start the first paragraph of my book with an interview with Muhammad Ali and a British journalist. And Ali is asked, by this journalist, he says, to Ali, you're very popular. You're the second most popular person in the United States, second to Richard Nixon. Would you like to be president? And Ali sort of say, oh, no. He starts with an analogy of being in the galley of a ship, and all of a sudden the captain of the ship asks you to come on the deck, and they begin to give you food and wine and liquor and whatever, and all of a sudden, because you weren't able to get to from the galley to the top, all of a sudden the person wants you to be the captain of the ship. And Ali says, as an answer to the journalist, this ship must be sinking. And so the question about and he was making references actually to the crop of black mayors that were being elected, that first wave in the early 1970s, when they began to be mayors of some cities like Newark, New Jersey, Gary, Indiana, East St. Louis, Illinois, Flint, Michigan, Detroit, Michigan, cities that were on a decline. And so, in many ways, the idea of a hollow prize operates in a dual way, in the sense that there are very few resources even to attend to some of the issues that are particular to communities of color and challenging this idea of the persistence of racial inequality. But it's a hollow prize because, again, a person who has to ascend, in this case Barack Obama, as President of the United States, in order to protect himself against favoring black people, he has to be mum on issues regarding racial inequality and even issues of poverty, because in many ways this is in a very wicked way the realization of the dream of the Democratic Leadership Conference, which is this group in 1980s that rose to bring the Democratic Party to the center, or some would say even to the right, because of the agitation of Jesse Jackson that black voters were hurting the Democratic Party, and therefore there needs to be less issues regarding talk of racism, or racial redress, and when white voters think about poor people, they think about black people. So the Democratic Party has to move the party to the center, and this is what led to President Clinton. But what's remarkable about this is that when it comes to those two issues of race and poverty, this president, in some ways, has been the realization of the dream of the Democratic Leadership Conference. They should have picked a black guy long time ago who was mom on race in order to pursue their agenda to moving the party to the center and to the right. So, in many ways, in that respect, I think it is a hollow prize.
Professor Smith, in thinking about these particular issues and Barack Obama's first term, how do you respond to criticism of people who have your point of view and Professor Harris's point of view, that you're basically in the Tavis Smiley and Cornel West camp, the ones that criticize the president but don't give him enough credit for the things that he has accomplished in his first term that no other president has been able to accomplish in any of their previous presidencies of this country, namely healthcare reform. And if that's the case, do you feel that you have some kind of you share some kind of similarities with Tavis Smiley and Dr. Cornel West in this area, or do you see there's a different point of view that you're pursuing?
I think my point of view is different, and I make this clear throughout the pages of my book, and I was very, very conscious of it in putting the book together. My focus has been on white voters' insistence that questions of race not be brought up, and white voters conditioning black political success, including Barack Obama's political success, on race being suppressed. So the root of the problem then is a perpetual exhaustion, a purported exhaustion on the part of white Americans with questions of race, even as racial inequality persists. So while I certainly have criticisms of Barack Obama, I locate the nexus of the problem, the source of the problem, well beyond Barack Obama. One might criticize the president for succumbing to the wishes, the desires of white voters in the manner that he has, for not pushing back. But I'm very clear about where the problem is, and the problem is with white Americans in their insistence on clinging to this false notion of colorblindness or post-racialism.
Do you agree with that, Dr. Harris?
I mean, I don't agree with the idea that I'm necessarily in the camp with Smiley and Cornel West. I think to make such suggestion only contributes to, or proves the point rather, about the poverty of discussions around issues about race and politics in contemporary American life. That things are so black and white, or you're for him or against him, that is the president, that there's no middle ground or gray area for criticism. Unlike Cornel West and Tavis Smiley, who I think criticisms in many ways are on point, but there's been so marked by personal attacks on the president that unfortunately it's given an opportunity for people to try to kill both the messengers or disregard the messengers as well as the message. My critique is really centered on politics and policy, which I think it should be. Although the political system is implicit, in my critique, my criticism is partly also directed toward black voters who unlike other constituencies, have not mobilized and put their issues on the agenda. And so, in many ways, again, this goes back to my criticism about protecting the president rather than pressuring the president to action. Is that in many ways we are complicit, African American voters are complicit in how low of a priority our issues are, our community-focused issues are, because we simply haven't demanded more. Now, that's just not to say, it's very complicated, because as I mentioned before, there are these universal issues that affect everyone that does disproportionately benefit African Americans. But there are community-centered issues around what to do about concentrated unemployment in black and brown communities. What should we do around criminal justice reform? Why hasn't the president, who seems to have shaken his fingers at Supreme Court justices at one State of the Union around Citizens United, or could speculate about what the Supreme Court's decision would be? The Supreme Court's decision would be around the health care reform bill, but has been mommed around one of the most important cases around affirmative action that was argued 2 weeks ago. We haven't heard anything, not a word, from this administration, other than I'm sure they support in the briefs they've sent to the Supreme Court. But there has been no public articulation about why, we need affirmative action or we don't need an affirmative action. At least on the last Democratic administration, we had mend it but don't end it. And so there's no sort of discussions on issues that are disproportionately affect our community. So unlike Tavis Smiley and Cornel West, I'm really centering my critique about the type of politics that the president is pursuing around issues of race, as well as why black voters are mostly capitulating to that type of strategy, and why there isn't enough attention as a result of that around specific policies.
We're talking with Professor Fred Harris of Columbia University and Professor Terry Smith of DePaul University, and Professor Smith's new book is Barack Obama, Post-Racialism and the New Politics of Triangulation, and Professor Harris's new book, The Price of the Ticket, Barack Obama and the Rise and Decline of Black Politics. This is WHCR 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem. One of the things that I read about and that I observe is this notion of in economics, how Barack Obama talks about how there's the upper percent, the upper 5 or 3 or 2% that make all this amazing amount of money, but that they're not paying or not contributing to their fair share. And it's not trickling down to the middle class and to the lower middle class and to our brothers and sisters in the community that are struggling in poverty. But it seems as if you turn it upside down and relate it to race, he feels like that type of racial politic and coming down from on top, from on high, will spread across the country and lift everybody up, and things will even itself out on the playing field, so to speak. And I think that's one area where I tend to disagree with the president on his approach to social policy as it relates to race, but he doesn't do that when it comes to economic policy. So I wanted to get your views on that particular notion of of social and racial policy coming from the top down. Professor Smith?
It is a contradiction. I mean, the president has, in his writings, has said that he believes that if things work out for the United States as a whole, for the population as a whole, this will, in turn, benefit African Americans. And he said that throughout his presidency. There's no question that there's some benefit to African Americans, but it doesn't close the racial gap. Even during the 1990s, during the Clinton presidency, when people thought that they, and in fact were better off, there was still gaping inequalities in black income versus white income, and black poverty versus white poverty, and in other socioeconomic indicators. So we know that that rising tides philosophy, or that white to black trickle down philosophy, doesn't work in practice, but it's one that politically the president, because he wants to avoid discussions of race, is forced to embrace.
Mm-hmm. And Professor Harris, I mean, to me, the centerpiece of this conversation that we've had over the last couple of minutes always comes back to me in my mind. Why is that? Why do you think that the president is reluctant to specifically address race with the public?
Oh, I mean, it's just quite obvious. He thinks it's going to hurt his.
But not only him, but I think a large number of African Americans, a lot of Democrats in general feel that it would hurt. And
right.
And do you think that it would or wouldn't?
Well, the thing is that I think there are some things that the president has to take a risk on. And it's not sort of lecturing to white people about why, racism is a horrible thing. My concern is really around policy issues, because there's just so much at stake. Particularly, I keep going back to criminal justice issues. And so we saw this skittishness around race with the Shirley Sherrod incident, where the poor woman in the agriculture department, a video that was sliced and diced, alleged that she had denied government agricultural loans to white farmers, when she was indeed saying that in the part that was sliced and diced, that she had learned from that, and she encouraged or helped everyone. But what was interesting about that is sort of how radioactive it became. She was fired even before she had an opportunity to tell her story. We saw this around Trayvon Martin, which the president just merely said, if I had a son, he would look like Trayvon. Or in the case of Henry Louis Gates, his arrest, and there was an inconsequential beer summit at the White House. What I'm seeing, actually, from some analysis by political scientists, is that when those issues have come up, and looking at their impact on the favorability ratings of the president, what you see is that they actually strengthen support favorability among black voters and have no effect on the favorability among white voters. Mm-hmm. And in fact, people attribute the incident with Henry Louis Gates, which I think was the president's first summer during his first term, that was the reason why you saw this decline in favorability ratings of the president. Is because he weighed in on the issue around Henry Louis Gates and the way he was treated. And, the Cambridge police acted stupidly, he said. But in fact, more systematic analysis has actually shown that what attributed to the president's falling in favorability had a lot to do with the economy, particularly falling prices in housing. And so I think there's just too much of a knee-jerk reaction. As I said before, under the previous Democratic administration, Bill Clinton wanted to have a national conversation about race, and in the age of Obama, you can't have a national conversation about race. Mm-hmm. And so the question becomes, what are the policy consequences of not discussing these issues?
And I would just add to that, though, that Clinton was more about conversation than deed. And it's really a historical trait of modern Democrats, at least, post-Lyndon Johnson, to run from the issue of race. And then Clinton triangulated on the issue of race himself. I mean, the use of Sister Souljah after the L.A. riots to demonstrate that he could distance himself from African-American voters, flying to Arkansas to oversee the execution of a black mentally retarded inmate, again, to show that he could be tough on crime, read African-Americans, was all part of Clinton's triangulation of race. So actually this is it's not just Obama. This is a Democratic phenomenon post-Lyndon Johnson.
And Professor Smith, some people might even add Lonnie Guinier to that
right.
list as well, during his early part of his first term.
Sure.
And I think that when we look at President Obama's first term, people would argue he's been strong in the area of law enforcement, foreign policy. I mean, the fact of all of these voter suppression laws being overturned by the courts, the latest one in Ohio, South Carolina, Texas, Pennsylvania, which would have effectively locked out a lot of minorities, African Americans, Latinos from voting this year and maybe into future years had these laws been able to stand on the books. And the fact that some people feel that it's because of Barack Obama's position as president that we've had a strong fight or pushback in these legislatures, in these state courthouses, in pushing back on voter suppression and also, upholding the Voting Rights Act in Section 5 and allowing everyone to have their vote without any compromise or abridgment.
Well, you're absolutely right, but I just want to push back on that for a moment because I think, to be quite honestly, any Democrat in the White House who's coming up for re-election would have opposed voter suppression. And the reason why this administration has been willing to risk weighing in on this is that it has consequences to whether the president will be reelected or not. Mm-hmm. So the question for me is what kind of risk around issues of race is the president willing to weigh in on? Right. And I think this will be the case, as I said before, of any Democratic administration.
Well, with our remaining minutes, I just want to ask you both briefly, if Barack Obama is elected to a second term, do you think that it'll be any markedly different from the first term, or we're going to get, as the Republicans say all the time, we're going to get more of the same? Or do you think that, as some people would like to say, they expect to see an angry black man or someone who's more of a fighter in the second term because he doesn't have to worry about ever running for office again, and he can do the things that he's promised to do in terms of immigration and addressing the African American community's needs, and all of the promises that he's made? So, Professor Smith, I'll start with you.
We certainly have no evidence that a second term will be better for African Americans than the first term, or I should say, we'll have more of a focus on African Americans than the first term did. We have no evidence of that, and moreover, frankly, given the fiscal terrain on which the president would be governing in a second term, and given the extent to which the Republicans have been able to starve the beast, to starve government, and to run up deficits, and create the kinds of circumstances that they've brought the economy to, one wonders what the president's ability will be to deliver for poor and African Americans. One wonders.
Professor Harris, in the remaining sections we have, what's your opinion?
Yeah, I pretty much agree with Professor Smith. I don't think the political terrain, at least in the next 2 years, is going to be all that different. the Democrats may hold on to the Senate, but I'll be surprised if the Republicans or the Democrats rather maintain hold of the House. So what you're going to have is divided government, and the president working with not only all the economic issues that Professor Smith mentioned, but also have to navigate once again the political terrain in divided government.
Well, I definitely want to thank both my guests today, Professor Harris, who's a professor of political science at Columbia University, and his book is The Price of the Ticket, Barack Obama and the Rise and Decline of Black Politics, and also Professor Terry Smith of DePaul University College of Law, and his book is Barack Obama Post-Racialism and the New Politics of Triangulation. I want to thank both my guests for coming on and giving us your insight in this very, very important topic, especially at this point in our country's history and right before the election. And I'd like to say, having known both of you and knowing both of your positions on this, I guess my feeling is that I do agree with a lot of what you said, but I guess if I was asked for my bottom line, I think it was worth the price of the ticket, because hopefully he won't be the last. This is just the beginning of the first. And from Barack Obama's presidency, we can build upon all the issues that need to be addressed in this particular area. So I want to thank you once again, and hopefully I can invite you back, and then we'll take calls from our listeners as well, because I'm sure that'll be a very interesting element to add into this discussion as well. So thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
You're listening to Legalese, and this is Tony Johnson, WHCR 90.3 FM, the legal voice of Harlem. And next week's show is going to be centered around felony convictions and those of us in the community who have been formally convicted and are now in society with the challenge of trying to get a job, trying to